Hello, my name is Abigail Manis, and this is my Gothic literature research project presentation for the Lindenwood Workshop research thingamabooby. So, my presentation is called And Then There Were None. The figure of the nun in Gothic literature during the 18th and 19th centuries was an inevitable occurrence. Upon combining the genre's distinctly anti-Catholic flavor with its obsession with gender roles, nuns are an obvious choice. Here we see a group of women forever out of the grasp of sexual objectification and of motherhood, two primary things for which the patriarchy used the fairer sex. Celibate and solitary, they are for all intents and purposes sexless, yet they retain the lack of authority of their former female roles. In Matthew Lewis's famous 1796 novel, The Monk, nuns are portrayed in any number of ways. Imprisoned angels, cruel torturers, demonic seductresses, and more. One character, upon expressing her wish to join the order, is strongly warned against it by another character, a nun who had only recently been saved from her vocation. This warning held within it the, quote, numerous inconveniences attached to a convent. The lesson of how disastrous it is to resist acting on one's own natural desires is arguably one of the biggest themes in this novel, a lesson for which the nun is uniquely suited. Now, after a brief rundown of the perception of nuns around the time The Monk was written, I'm going to take you back to the origins of the nun and then discuss their evolution in culture and depictions in The Monk. Finally, I'll list their modern presence and the trope of the nun figure as it appears in the 2018 movie, The Nun. My thesis here is that Western culture is obsessed with women of holy orders as taboo/forbidden objects. This, along with the Gothic's obsession with gender roles, makes the nun a perfect archetype for the genre. I've made a PowerPoint and I'll post the link down below so you can follow along. It's a little bit bare bones, but there are some kind of interesting visuals that I've included, so you can decide on whether or not you want to do that. So slide 1. In her essay, Early Modern Nuns and the Feminist Politics of Religion, Ulrich Strasser begins by describing the practices of Christian nuns in the eyes of the general public as, quote, a part of the medieval past that must be overcome in order to propel us into the modern age. Their chastity, complete obedience to superiors, and humble lifestyle counters the Enlightenment idea of the developing world by showcasing a group of women who insist on living in the past rather than embracing the present. Matthew Lewis, author of the famous classical Gothic book, The Monk, seemed to think so in his story, as most of his nuns are either forced into the habit, pun intended, or become sexless baby killers because of it. But we'll get more into that later. This was the current perception of nunhood, a crippling restriction that kept a woman from her proper duties of service to man. But again, before we get into that can of worms, we should take it back to some earlier holy women. Nuns have been around in some form or another since the dawn of Christianity. Some scholars, such as Diane Long-Hovler of Marquette University, who is extremely prolific on this topic, insist that these holy women were adapted from the Vestal Virgins in ancient Rome. Vestal Virgins were women who took 30-year-long vows of celibacy and servitude to the temple of Vesta, or in Greek, Hestia, and keep the hearth flame lit. This was a huge honor, bold, underlined, italicized, huge honor. And many young girls of noble birth were actually forced into it by their families because it would give them celebrity. If a Vestal Virgin were caught having broken her vow of celibacy during the 30-year period, she would be imprisoned in a hole in the ground and sealed in alive. Interestingly similar to the treatment Sister Agnes receives in The Monk. Once the 30 years were up, the woman could marry, though few did. Starting with the Middle Ages and moving forward into modernity, the perfect woman turned into a mother who could produce offspring to replenish the reduced population. I didn't find a source for this because it's a pattern that we see during and after many periods of wartime in history. The female identity was so dependent on men that a popular term for nuns were brides of Christ, signifying that despite living their lives without communion with mortal men, they were not allowed to profess this independence. Instead, they were simply changing their yoke from natural man to supernatural man. Slide 2. According to Hovler, the figure of the medieval nun was one of, as she says, ambivalently sexual fascination. Her arguments about convent occupants being women, maddeningly frustrated with their lots in life, provides interesting support for an argument by scholar E.G. Cleary about the Gothic functioning as an outlet for female bourgeois frustration. Though initially a place for women looking for a refuge and an honorable career in the Middle Ages, as time passed, the convent grew to be a space for families to imprison their unmarriageable or sexually deviant daughters. This makes me think of Hamlet's famous line to Ophelia, "Get thee to a nunnery," because that term meant a convent, yet also at this time a brothel. Shakespeare also references the convent as a punishment when, in the beginning act of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the character Hermia is forced to choose between marrying a suitor she doesn't love or being conscripted into life as a nun. The famous 12th century star-crossed couple, Eloisa and Abelard, provide another example of the repression women suffered at the hands of the convent. At her lover's urging, Eloisa became a nun and he a monk, and they wrote to each other from their cloisters until death. Grim surroundings described by Alexander Pope in his 18th century work, Eloisa to Abelard, which was inspired by this true story, well, arguably true story, showcase Eloisa as a woman feeling constrained by her surroundings and depressed by her vocation. Here are lines 17 through 20 of that poem. Relentless walls, whose darksome round contains repentant sighs and voluntary pains, ye rugged rocks, which holy knees have worn, ye grots and caverns, shagged with horrid thorn. So it's safe to say she wasn't really loving the whole convent lifestyle. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Enlightenment and Catholicism became under attack by an increasing Protestant majority, one of the most obvious topics of criticism was the convent and its occupants. According to Hovler, the Gothic provided a mode for authors to perpetuate discourse by, quote, keeping alive specters and apparitions of both the sacred and the demonic, even as they castigated the failings of a formal, institutionalized religion that they wished to forget they had ever embraced. Slide 3. In her master's thesis, and yes, I did read the whole thing, Marie House dissects 3 depictions of the Gothic nun, Lewis's The Monk being one of them. House, like Hovler, points to the perception of the medieval nun as a contrast between her chastity and inaccessibility, being a sign of virtue, yet also a cause for erotic speculation. In The Monk, Lewis makes a clear point to show the disastrous consequences that befall those who go against their natural sexual urges, and far from being excluded from that fate, his nuns are central to it. Jessie Molesworth continues the discussion of nuns as vehicles for consequence in The Monk, but mentions in one section of her essay that the bleeding nun, one of the most darkly iconic images in Lewis's work, was not an original character. According to Lewis, the bleeding nun was a figure already prominent in German tradition, which shows that even before The Monk, the form of a nun was already becoming corrupted. Wendy Jones argues that erotic desire and freedom of identity are intrinsically linked in The Monk. With Agnes, once she thinks her lover Raymond abandons her, she relinquishes her sexual freedom and allows her family to convince her to take her vows. As Jones says, the renunciation of Agnes's sexuality depends upon her silence. Many monastic orders require a vow of silence, so this is yet another instance of the pointed fallibility of the convent in Lewis's eyes. Now here is a short list of the different nun figures that we see in The Monk. We have Agnes, a fallen angel who atones for her sins and is saved from being a nun. The prioress and her nunlets, twisted unwomen who lack a crucial element of womanliness, that being the will to nurture and save an unborn infant. Mother St. Ursula, a woman who shows suspiciously Protestant views and decries the hypocrisy of the Catholic convent. The Bloody Nun, a ghost of a nun who, when alive, was forced into nunhood and became pent up enough, sexually speaking, to take 2 lovers and murder one at the behest of the other. Matilda, a hermaphroditic nun who turns out to be literally a demon disguised as a nun. We'll get into that later. And Virginia, not a nun, but expresses the desire to be one until a rescued Agnes warns her strictly against it. Now let's jump into the age of nunsploitation. We'll start in the 1970s with The Devils, and that is a movie by Ken Russell. It's a dramatized account of the alleged possession of a 17th century priest and his following of sexually repressed nuns. Then we move into 1974 with Flavia the Heretic, a movie about a nun who teams up with a group of Muslims to besiege her former convent and kill those who wronged her. Then in 1979, we go to Killer Nun. A nun who is the head nurse of a hospital succumbs to her morphine addiction and psychosis and begins spreading death and depravity through the course of the movie. And this series of perpetually more demonic and corrupted depictions of nuns kind of shows this increased presence of the demonic in Gothic literature and the destruction of the idea of a nun as a pure figure in the modern time. If you look at my PowerPoint, I put a picture of a sexy nun costume. It's funny, sure, but it also shows our craving for this pure figure being defiled in some way. This all leads up to Corin Hardy's movie The Nun, released in 2018 as a prequel to the famous Conjuring movie franchise. It is the epitome of religious Gothic tropes. It's set in the 1950s in post-World War II Romania at an abbey with subterraneous passageways, medieval secrets, a mystery to solve, and of course, a demonic nun. The demon in question, Valak, is from the previous installment in the Conjuring series, the movie Annabelle. Valak's inspiration was taken from a demon of the same name in the Lesser Key of Solomon, a grimoire that details many demonic occupants of hell. Though the demon is referred to as male, its presence in the form of a female-coded religious figure rather than a priest points to a further distortion of the female identity upon entrance into the Holy Order. Very similar to Valak's male presence invading a female form is the character of Matilda in The Monk, a nun who lures our titular monk character further and further into corruption until finally, when he is firmly in the grasp of perdition, she reveals her inhumanity and relinquishes her soul. Please stop mowing your lawn. I understand. It's nice outside. Though The Nun was not particularly well received, it only got like a 5 out of 10 on IMDb, and last time I checked, it was 26% on Rotten Tomatoes. It does provide an insight into our culture's consciousness of the Gothic. The demon Valak is summoned during the Middle Ages by a Romanian duke who dabbled in the occult. The duke is killed before he can finish the ritual, and the demon remains imprisoned for centuries until bombs from World War II fall on the property, exploding with enough force to release Valak. I mean, whatever works, right? The demon then begins to torment the convent, while groups of nuns must take shifts to pray the evil away. This post-war chaos mirrors that of The Monk in the tumult of the French Revolution. Ultimately, the Gothic imagery and the villainous nun in this modern story prove that though the vicious suppression of young women's life and love may have faded with the modern age, the image of the nun as an artifact from medieval times persists to this day. Valak eventually being set free by the bombs of World War II and not anything supernatural reminds me of the French Revolution that provided the main catalyst for the rise of Gothic literature in the first place. Though this movie was produced for little more than creepy factor and to sell Halloween novelties, its themes are the modern product of Western culture's obsession with nuns and what they represent. The fact that even though it was made in 2018, it is set in the 1950s shows our refutation of the nun as a modern construct, and furthermore buries it in the past along with monks and pardoners and the like. As the supernatural in the Gothic transformed from divine to demonic, so too did the influence on perception of nuns as symbols of purity. Pureness defiled is infinitely compelling to a modern, post-Holocaust, post-AIDS, post-9/11, soon-to-be post-COVID-19 traumatized society. Catholics are no longer persecuted or ridiculed in the same way that they were during Lewis's time, aside from, of course, the odd altar boy joke or two, but the nun figure still persists as a model of repression and veiled, pun intended, impurity. The dark allure of a forbidden, sexless woman persists today. The body of woman is already shrouded in mystery and controversy, and the Gothic excels at setting these contrasting elements against and alongside each other. Gothic nuns provide a perfect mode for bridging the divide between the sacred and the profane, the chaste and the erotic, the natural, and the supernatural.